The city never really slept in those years, even when the streets went quiet and the factory whistles stopped echoing off the blackened brick walls. Cleveland in the 1930s was a place that breathed in cold, heavy drafts, a city where the Great Depression had carved deep lines in the faces of men and women who had already lost more than they could count. Fires from the steel mills glowed against the sky like angry wounds, and the river carried the smell of oil and rot. People kept their heads down, minded their own business, and prayed that tomorrow would come with a little more warmth than the day before. But beneath all of that, in the deepest corners of Kingsbury Run, something else was breathing. Something patient. Something hungry. The area known as Kingsbury Run stretched like a wound through the east side of the city, a scar of railroad tracks, shanty huts, and makeshift shelters where the forgotten tried to survive another night. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions. No one had the right to. Poverty made everyone quiet and fear made them quieter. But in 1934, the silence began to feel heavier. It clung to the air like damp fog. People whispered about strange sounds at night, wet dragging noises, and footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of any person living in those shacks. Most dismissed it as rats or drunks stumbling around. But deep down, everyone felt it. Something was moving through Kingsbury Run that didn't belong. It began with a body, or rather, part of a body. In September of 1934, two boys walking near the run found what they thought at first was a piece of animal meat dumped from one of the slaughterhouses. But the closer they got, the slower they moved until both of them froze completely. What lay in front of them was a woman's lower torso, the skin pale and smooth, severed cleanly as though cut with a blade sharpened for a single purpose. The head was missing. The arms were missing. The rest of her was gone. The boys didn't scream at first. They couldn't. They only backed away, step by step, until one of them finally found enough breath to yell for help. But help in this case only came to reveal more horror. Police arrived, expecting a single body part, but what they found instead was the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch over 4 long years and haunt Cleveland forever. The woman's upper torso was discovered nearby. Her fingers were clean. Her body showed no signs of decay. Whoever had done this had killed her recently, cut her apart with careful precision, and dumped her remains as though discarding scraps. The detectives exchanged glances that said what none of them wanted to voice. This was no ordinary murder. People in the city read about it in the papers, shook their heads, and went back to their lives. Crime was common in the Depression. Death wasn't a stranger. But Kingsbury Run was different, and the people who lived there whispered to each other late at night that the killer would return. They felt it in the way the shadows seemed to grow longer, in the way stray dogs refused to walk certain paths. And they were right. Nearly a year later, in September 1935, a man walking his dog by Lake Erie stumbled upon something floating near the shore. It took him several seconds to realize what he was looking at. He turned away, retching, before running to call the police. The torso belonged to a man this time, the head cleanly severed, the lower half missing. The chest and abdomen showed marks, not just cutting marks, but something else. Scrapes, hesitations, as if the killer enjoyed the process. The detectives worked in silence that day, and every one of them understood that the city now had a pattern. But patterns have a way of refusing to stay still. 2 days later, half of the man's legs washed onto the shore. The body had been in the water for some time. Again, clean cuts. Again, precision. And again, no sign of who the victim really was. No head to identify, no clothing. Nothing that could lead back to the killer. By now, whispers traveled not just through Kingsbury Run but through the entire city. The papers called the killer the Mad Butcher. But the people living in the run had a different name. One whispered under trembling breaths, the thing that walked at night. Some of the men who lived in the shanty camps swore that they heard footsteps outside their makeshift huts long after midnight, slow, steady, deliberate. Not the rush of a drunk stumbling home, not the rush of an angry man, but something calm, something steady, as though the walker had all the time in the world. One man claimed he woke up one night to see a silhouette standing outside his doorway, tall, unmoving, watching. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. When he finally mustered the courage to sit up, the figure slipped away into the darkness, leaving no sound behind. The man left Kingsbury Run the next morning and never returned. The third victim was found in January 1936. Two men were sorting through rubbish at the bottom of a slope when they uncovered a basket, roughly tied shut with twine. The smell hit them before they even opened it. Inside were the remains of a woman, frozen, pale, and, like the others, headless. The detectives who arrived stared at the basket for a long time before touching it. One of them muttered that he had seen men butcher pigs in similar ways. Another said that the cuts looked cleaner than anything an inexperienced killer could have done. Someone with medical knowledge. Someone who understood anatomy. Fear spread deeper. People stopped walking alone. Men who once slept on the ground now slept in pairs, taking turns staying awake. But no amount of caution was enough because the killer wasn't hunting the careful. He was hunting the forgotten. Spring came with no relief. In June 1936, two teenagers were walking near the run when they discovered a man's decapitated head wrapped in a pair of trousers. They screamed, ran, and brought the police back. The detectives searched for hours until they found more remains scattered like discarded objects. The victim's arms were thrown down a nearby hill. His torso was buried under debris. The killer had not only dismembered him, he had taken his time. But something about this victim felt different. His fingerprints were still intact. The police identified him. He was a bricklayer, a working man, someone with a life, a job, friends. That realization sent another wave of terror through Cleveland. The killer wasn't only targeting the poor or the homeless. He was choosing people at random. Detective Peter Merylo, a man who had spent years chasing the worst criminals the city had to offer, began walking through the run at night disguised as a homeless drifter. He ate scraps with the tents, residents, slept next to them, and whispered to them in the darkness. But every night he felt the same thing, an unseen presence that watched from behind the trees, from behind the darkness, from places where even moonlight refused to touch. The summer of 1936 brought heat that suffocated the city. The nights were thick, filled with the buzzing of insects and the sound of distant railroad engines. That August, a teenage girl walking near the Euclid Beach amusement park saw what she thought was a mannequin lying near the water. Something pale, something too still. When she got closer, she realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was a torso neatly cut, with the limbs and head missing. The water lapped against it gently, as though trying to wash away evidence of what had happened. Detective Eliot Ness, known for his battles against Chicago's gangsters, was now safety director in Cleveland. When he heard of the fourth victim, he slammed his fist on his desk. He had been trying to push back against the rising crime in the city, trying to restore some sense of order. But this murderer mocked everything he was trying to build. This killer wasn't afraid. This killer wanted to be seen. But fear in a city doesn't explode suddenly. It bubbles. It grows. And with each new discovery, Cleveland felt that slow boil turning into something more dangerous, something close to mass panic. By early 1937, the killings became more frequent, and each body seemed more brutal than the last. One victim was found with the wrists burned, boiled, the coroner said. Another victim had been decapitated while still alive. These details were kept from the public at first, but information always finds cracks to seep through. People began whispering about the killer being someone with access to medical tools, someone who knew exactly how to inflict pain without letting the victim die too fast. Some even said the killer might be a doctor gone mad. Others said it wasn't a man at all, but something that had climbed out of the run itself, something born from the filth and hunger. The residents of Kingsbury Run felt the fear more deeply than anyone else. Their lives were already hanging by loose threads, and now something was cutting through those threads one by one. They slept with knives, with broken bottles, with rusted scraps of metal. Some tried to leave, but where could they go? The city had no room for the poor, no place to hide. One night, in the middle of that growing terror, an old man who lived in a cardboard shelter claimed he saw something moving across the tracks. Something tall. Something carrying what looked like a sack over its shoulder. He didn't speak up until the next morning, when police found another headless corpse nearby. The victim's chest had been carved open. The organs had been removed. The killer had left footprints in the mud, large ones, deeper than normal, as though the person carrying the body had incredible strength. The old man fled the next day, convinced he had witnessed a demon. And yet the killings continued. By mid-1937, the city was unraveling. People walked faster, locked their doors earlier. Children were kept indoors. The newspapers printed story after story, their headlines screaming warnings, but none of it mattered. The killer never slowed down. He only grew bolder. He only grew hungrier. He only grew closer. As Cleveland braced itself for another year of fear, Kingsbury Run lay in silent darkness, waiting, knowing the killer's shadow was already moving again, already choosing the next victim, already sharpening the blade. And somewhere in the city, the butcher walked freely, blending with crowds, watching his next prey, knowing no one could stop him, not yet. The winter of 1937 settled over Cleveland like a heavy shroud, pressing down on roofs, weighing on the backs of men who trudged through the streets in search of work that never came. Snow covered the rail tracks of Kingsbury Run, smoothing out the filth, the garbage, the abandoned bottles and rusted cans. For a moment the run looked almost peaceful, quiet, white, almost clean. But everyone who lived there knew the truth. Snow was only a blanket, a thin one, and underneath it the rot still festered. Underneath it the butcher still walked. The killing slowed for a few weeks, just enough for people to pretend, lie to themselves, that maybe the nightmare had passed, but the fear never truly left. It hovered. It listened. Even the quiet had a pulse, steady and ominous, as though the city itself was holding its breath. But on a frigid night in February, when the winds whipped down from Lake Erie and clawed through the streets like skeletal hands, the silence broke again. A railroad worker trudging along the tracks spotted something half buried in the snow. At first, he thought it was just a scrap of cloth, a sack tossed from a passing train. But the closer he got, the more his knees seemed to weaken. The snow around the object was slightly tinted, a faint blush of red spreading outward like ink in water. He kicked the snow away with trembling boots. It was a head. Frozen, expressionless, eyes partially open as though death had caught the victim mid-plea. The man screamed into the empty air, and his voice echoed across Kingsbury Run like a distress call no one could answer. Police arrived quickly, searching the tracks, brushing away layers of snow until they found the rest of the remains, limbs scattered in a line, almost intentionally placed, as though the killer wanted the detectives to follow the path he had created. The torso, mutilated more violently than any before, lay at the bottom of an embankment, the chest carved open with deliberate cruelty. The killer had taken his time. The killer had enjoyed the slicing. Every coroner who examined the body later agreed that the victim had been alive when the first cuts were made. That detail was never printed in the newspapers, but fear spreads even without ink. Detective Peter Merylo walked the crime scene with slow steps, hands buried in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold. The other officers knew the look on his face. He was seeing patterns, footprints, disposal methods, places where the killer might have paused, maybe even stood to admire his work. Merylo had spent nights inside the run, pretending to be just another desperate man trying to stay warm. But every night felt the same, like a pair of unseen eyes were following him, always a few steps behind, always slipping away when he turned. Detective Eliot Ness arrived an hour later, shoulders tense, jaw locked. The newspapers mocked him relentlessly now, mocked his failure to bring the murderer down, mocked his inability to control the city, mocked the idea that the legendary crime fighter could be helpless against a lone butcher who roamed the slums without fear. Ness stared at the victim's remains without speaking for a long, long time. Snowflakes fell onto the exposed flesh, melting into tiny droplets before freezing again. Ness finally muttered. "He's getting braver." Merylo answered softly, "He wants us to see this." The city reeled from the discovery. People stayed indoors. Bar owners closed earlier. Train conductors warned their workers not to walk alone. But the butcher fed on the fear. He breathed it in. And within weeks he struck again. In June 1937, a young laborer walking near the Central Market District found a man's dismembered torso wrapped in butcher paper. The irony was cruel. Cut flesh wrapped like a cut of meat, placed where fresh produce and cattle parts were sold every day. As detectives unwrapped the paper, the stench made some gag, others look away. The body had begun to rot. The coroner said the victim had been dead for at least a week, but where the killer stored him during that week was impossible to know. As they searched nearby, police found the legs stuffed inside 2 burlap sacks. The arms were found in a trash bin behind a bakery. The head was never recovered. The killer was scattering the remains across the city now, not just the Run, forcing Cleveland to confront the horror in places where ordinary people walked daily. The city was no longer a passive witness. It was a playground, a canvas, a message. People whispered about the butcher in grocery lines, in barbershops, in church pews. Mothers held their children closer. Men walked home in pairs. The fear that had once lived only in Kingsbury Run now seeped into every neighborhood, every street, every corner where shadows lingered too long. But the killer did not care about fear. He cared about the craft. He cared about the cutting. He cared about the silence that came before a victim realized he could not escape. Later that summer, another victim surfaced, this time in the Cuyahoga River. A tugboat operator spotted a shape floating lazily downstream. When the police hauled it out, the body was bloated, discolored, and missing a head. The legs had been hacked off at the knees. Even in decomposition, the cuts looked precise, deliberate. The victim had been male, but beyond that, nothing could be determined. The river had stolen too many clues. By now, the coroner's office was overwhelmed. Bodies came in pieces. Tags and labels had to be attached to limbs that may or may not match the torsos they arrived with. Some nights, coroners worked until dawn, surrounded by cold metal tables and the smell of antiseptic mixed with decay. The men grew quiet. Their eyes turned hollow. Even those who didn't believe in evil began to reconsider. One coroner, Dr. Gerber, stared at the remains of the latest victim and whispered, "This isn't rage. This is ritual." When that statement leaked through the police department, the newspapers seized it. Soon, rumors ran wild. People spoke of cults, deranged surgeons, ex-military butchers, escaped asylum patients. Some said the killer was targeting specific people. Others said he was choosing at random. But one thing united every whisper, every rumor, every terrified theory. The killer was not stopping. In fact, he seemed to be accelerating. Late in July 1937, 2 boys playing near an abandoned factory discovered a severed woman's arm. They ran screaming, and detectives combed the factory grounds until nightfall. They found nothing else. No torso, no head, no legs. Just the arm, pale and stiff, resting on a mound of dirt as though the killer had placed it there intentionally. Ness called an emergency meeting that night, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups tremble. He wanted a plan, something shocking enough to force change, something powerful enough to flush the killer out. The men in the room exchanged uneasy glances because they all knew what Ness was considering. A raid on Kingsbury Run. Not a gentle sweep, not a targeted search. A cleansing. Days later, Ness ordered dozens of officers, firemen, and city workers into the Run. They stormed the shantytown at dawn, pulling men from their makeshift shelters, tearing down huts, burning everything that could be burned. Flames devoured the fragile homes of the homeless, their few possessions, their blankets, their cardboard walls. Smoke rolled over the tracks and drifted into Cleveland like a warning. Ness justified it by claiming the killer might be hiding there, blending in with the drifters. But the raid caught no murderer, no evidence, no clue, only frightened, displaced men who had already lost everything long before the butcher came into their lives. When reporters asked Ness if he believed the killer had been among the homeless, he only said, "We had to try something." But deep down, he knew he had gained nothing. If anything, the butcher had been watching the raid with amusement. Because soon after the fires died, the killings resumed. On a muggy September afternoon in 1937, a patrolman spotted something unusual floating near a railroad trestle. The shape was almost unrecognizable at first, distorted by water and rot. When they pulled it from the riverbank, they realized it was the upper half of a man's torso. The lower half was found a mile downstream. The victim's arms had been severed close to the shoulders. The head was gone. The coroner concluded that the victim had been decapitated post-mortem, but the cuts showed expertise. The blade had moved almost gracefully, avoiding bone ridges with practiced ease. When Dr. Gerber finished his examination, he told the detectives something that chilled them. "The killer is improving. Improving. As if this was art. As if the victims were canvas. The butcher was not simply killing, he was refining his craft." By the end of 1937, Cleveland was drowning in fear. Every alley seemed darker, every stranger seemed suspicious. Every silence felt too heavy, too deliberate. Kingsbury Run was half empty now, most of its former residents scattered into the city's hidden corners. But even in its emptiness, the run felt alive. People avoided walking near it. They avoided even looking at it. The killer's shadow lingered there, thickening the air. Then came 1938. A year where the butcher would commit his most brazen, most horrifying crimes yet. A year where everything would escalate beyond anything Cleveland had seen. A year where even Ness himself would nearly lose his sanity trying to end the nightmare. It began in early April. A man collecting scrap metal behind an abandoned building near East 66th Street uncovered a burlap sack that looked strangely heavy. He tugged at the knot, expecting to find stolen tools or discarded machinery parts. Instead, a pale arm rolled out onto the ground. The man dropped the bag and staggered backward. He whispered a prayer, then sprinted to find the nearest patrolman. When detectives opened the sack completely, they found the dismembered remains of a woman. The torso had been carefully sliced into two sections. The head had been removed with such precision that even the hardened investigators fell silent. The body showed signs of torture, long, shallow cuts, burns, bruises. Whoever the killer was, he had spent a long time with this victim. Too long. Some detectives walked away to vomit in the weeds. Others stared at the remains with numb eyes. But Detective Merylo leaned close, studying each cut, each angle, each detail. "He's experimenting," he whispered. The word sent a chill through everyone present. Experimenting. Practicing. Perfecting. With each new victim, the butcher's technique became more controlled, more exact, more confident. And those who studied the bodies began to feel something they never admitted aloud. The killer was growing comfortable. Comfortable moving through the city. Comfortable hunting in the open. Comfortable knowing no one could catch him. By late April, another victim appeared, this time in a vacant lot behind a row of rundown houses. Children playing nearby had spotted something strange in a weed-choked corner. What they thought was a bundle of rags turned out to be a headless man's body, torso propped almost upright against a crumbling brick wall, as though posed intentionally. When detectives found the head a day later, placed neatly in a box under a wooden plank, they realized the killer was leaving them clues, mocking them, teasing them, leading them wherever he pleased. And Cleveland followed. Because it had no choice. Because the nightmare had become part of the city's bloodstream. Because the butcher walked among them, moving unseen, watching everything, choosing the next victim even as the police gathered at the latest scene. And as spring thickened into summer, the killer prepared for the most shocking murders of all, the ones that would push Ness to the breaking point and drive fear into Cleveland in a way no one had imagined possible. The butcher was not slowing down. He was not hiding. He was evolving. And the city was running out of time. By the summer of 1938, Cleveland no longer moved the way it once did. People walked with their shoulders raised, their eyes constantly shifting to the edges of sidewalks, scanning alley mouths, checking the shadows under bridges. The air smelled different too, something sour, something uneasy. Even the river seemed to carry the tension, pulling broken tree limbs and floating debris like they were drifting warnings. Kingsbury Run had become a scar no one wanted to touch, but everyone could feel throbbing beneath the surface. Detective Eliot Ness stayed awake most nights. He sat at his desk with cold coffee and stacks of reports spread like a mosaic of failure across the wood. He had built his reputation fighting organized crime, dismantling bootlegging rings, tearing apart criminal networks. But this one man, one shadow was defeating him. And worse, Ness felt the killer was watching him, lingering just out of view, studying his movements, mocking him. Detective Merylo wasn't sleeping either. He returned again and again to the run, wandering the old paths where the victims had been found, walking the tracks long after midnight, blending into the darkness, listening for the softest hint of something out of place. Sometimes he felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Sometimes he stopped walking and stared into the trees, certain, absolutely certain, that someone was standing there. But when he moved closer, he found nothing but the shifting shapes of weeds and dim moonlight. The city held its breath as the days climbed toward July. On the morning of July 16, 1938, a man walking his dog near the Cleveland Municipal Stadium spotted something caught on the rocks along the shore. A bundle of fabric, something pale sticking out. He approached slowly, the dog whining at his side. When he reached it, he froze. A human leg. He stumbled backward, tripping on the uneven stones, then ran screaming for help. Police arrived quickly, the wind from the lake biting at their faces. As they searched the shoreline, they found more pieces, arms, sections of torso, a hand tangled in a scrap of fishing net. The waves had carried the remains and dropped them along the rocks like pieces of driftwood. The body was female. The cuts were clean, almost elegant, as though the killer had carved her with practiced ease. The coroner estimated she had been dead for only 48 hours. Detective Merylo stood over the remains, jaw tense, heart sinking. The butcher was growing bolder, leaving bodies in places impossible to ignore. Eliot Ness arrived soon after, trench coat whipping in the lake wind. He stared silently at the body parts. Everyone around him could feel the anger pouring off him like heat. "This has to stop," Ness said quietly, almost to himself. "This ends now." But the butcher wasn't finished. Not even close. That same afternoon, while officers were still searching for more remains near the stadium, a group of teenagers playing near a bridge south of the run spotted something lying near a patch of weeds. The boys approached cautiously. When they saw the pale shape, they ran screaming down the street. Police found the second victim of the day, a male, dismembered like the others, but something about this scene was different. The body hadn't been carried far. The killer had worked close to the discovery site. Dirt was kicked up around the torso. Grass was flattened. The ground showed signs of struggle. The victim had fought hard. Finger-shaped bruises ringed his arms. Defensive wounds covered his hands. And the worst part, the part that chilled every officer present, was the coroner's immediate conclusion. He was alive during dismemberment. The statement hung in the humid air like a sentence. Alive. The butcher had grown into something else now. No longer a precise, calculated killer, but something more feral, more violent, more eager to feel the life drain from the victim piece by piece. Ness ordered the area sealed off. Reporters swarmed the barricades, yelling questions about the possibility of 2 murders in a single day. Ness pushed past them without a word. His face looked carved from stone. That night, Ness did something he had sworn he would never do again. He ordered another purge of Kingsbury Run. But this time it was far harsher. Police swept through the run like a storm, dragging men from their shelters, searching every crate, every tunnel, every burnt-out shack. They arrested dozens of drifters, interrogated them for hours, burned more shanties, tore down whole sections of the encampment until the run was nothing but flattened earth and smoldering debris. Some witnesses said Ness seemed almost desperate. Others said he seemed unhinged. But deep down, Ness wasn't hunting for the killer anymore. He was trying to break the pattern, trying to break the fear, trying to break the cycle that had been choking the city for 4 years. But the butcher didn't hide in Kingsbury Run. He wasn't among the homeless. He was something else, moving freely, hunting freely, untouched by the city's attempts to corner him. And he wasn't finished. Not with Cleveland. Not with Ness. Not with the nightmare he had created. The weeks after the July murders were suffocating. Rain fell in erratic bursts, turning the run into a swamp of black mud and slick gravel. The city felt like it was sinking deeper into an invisible swamp of fear. Churches filled on Sundays. Bars filled every night. Men who once laughed easily now spoke in whispers. Women clutched their children's hands until the knuckles turned white. Businesses near the run lost customers. People refused to walk the area unless absolutely necessary. Some of the homeless drifted back, wandering like ghosts among the ruins of the shanty town, stepping over charred wood and broken bottles. Detective Merylo continued to search, but exhaustion was wearing him down. His eyes were hollow. His hands shook when he held his flashlight in the dark tunnels beneath the city. He didn't know if he would ever find the killer, but he couldn't stop looking. Something pulled him forward, some instinct deeper than logic, deeper than procedure. One night, while walking near an abandoned railway tunnel, Merylo froze. He felt it, the presence again. Something watching him from the dark. He swung his flashlight toward the tunnel entrance. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating damp walls, hanging icicles of mineral deposits, scattered bottles. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But Merylo's heart raced. He stepped closer, shining the light deeper into the tunnel. The silence felt unnatural, thick, almost alive. Then he heard it. A scrape. Soft. Deliberate. Metal against stone. Merylo ran toward the sound, boots pounding the ground, flashlight shaking. But when he reached the far end of the tunnel, it was empty. Nothing but the echoes of his own footsteps, bouncing back like mocking laughter. He knew he had just missed the killer. He knew he had been watched again. And he knew the butcher was still hunting. By autumn, Cleveland had changed permanently.